The cruelest moments rarely begin with shouting. They begin when an entire room decides that one person's dignity no longer matters. The grand ballroom of the Castellano estate shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, where warm golden light reflected across polished marble floors and rows of perfectly arranged tables dressed in black linen and fresh white roses. Every guest wore custom evening attire worth more than many families earned in a year, and every conversation floated through the air with effortless confidence. Naomi Carter moved quietly among them in her neatly pressed Black Maid uniform, carrying a silver serving tray with practiced grace. At nearly 30 years old, she had learned that invisible people often survived longer than those who demanded attention. She greeted every guest with genuine courtesy, lowered her eyes whenever someone ignored her, and continued working with the calm professionalism that had earned the respect of every member of the household staff. She never imagined that tonight would ask more from her than patience. Near the center of the ballroom, a wealthy guest reached for a crystal glass of red wine just as another brushed past his shoulder. The expensive drink splashed across the front of an elegant white jacket before striking the polished floor. For a heartbeat, silence settled over the nearby tables. Then the embarrassed guest slowly turned toward Naomi. His expression searched for someone to blame, and the nearest person happened to be the maid holding an empty serving tray. "You did this," he declared with complete certainty, even though dozens of people had witnessed the accident unfold differently. Naomi blinked once, then answered with quiet respect that she had not touched the table. Her voice never rose. Her posture never changed. She simply spoke the truth. Unfortunately, truth carried very little weight against pride. A second guest laughed softly before suggesting that she should kneel immediately and clean the floor before anyone slipped. Another nodded in agreement. Soon several voices joined together, not because they believed she was guilty, but because blaming someone powerless was easier than admitting an uncomfortable mistake. Naomi looked at the crimson stain spreading across the pale marble. She knew arguing would only make the situation worse. Around her, dozens of expensive watches sparkled beneath the chandeliers while polished dress shoes remained carefully outside the growing stain, as though protecting leather mattered more than protecting another person's dignity. She slowly placed the silver tray on a nearby service table and reached for a folded cleaning cloth. Before she could bend down, one of the guests spoke again with a smug smile that echoed louder than the music playing in the background. "Not like that," he said. "On your knees." Several people exchanged uneasy glances, yet no one interrupted. Some looked away. Others pretended to continue their conversations. A few even smiled, relieved that someone else had become the evening's entertainment instead of them. Naomi closed her eyes for the briefest moment. She thought about the medical bills waiting at home, about the promise she had made to keep supporting the only family she had left, and about how losing this position would change everything. Her fingers tightened around the cleaning cloth before relaxing once more. She lowered herself toward the marble with quiet composure, determined to protect her future even if tonight demanded more humility than anyone should ever have to give. High above the ballroom, hidden beyond the carved stone balcony where shadows softened the golden light, another pair of steady eyes had witnessed every second from the very beginning, and not a single detail had escaped his attention. Naomi rested both hands on the cool marble floor and began wiping away the spilled wine with slow, careful movements, refusing to let her trembling hands reveal what her heart was fighting to hide. The soft music continued as though nothing unusual had happened, while conversations resumed around her with the strange comfort that often follows when a crowd convinces itself that silence is easier than courage. Every polished shoe that stepped around the stain reminded her that people could avoid a puddle more easily than they could confront injustice. She kept her breathing steady. She had practiced that skill long before she ever walked into the Castellano estate. 3 years earlier, she had promised her late father that no hardship would ever convince her to surrender her character. After his passing, that promise became the foundation of her life. Her mother now depended on expensive medication every month, and every paycheck Naomi earned carried more than money. It carried hope, responsibility, and another chance to keep her family together. Losing this position would not simply cost her employment. It would mean choosing which bills could wait and which necessities would have to disappear. That thought hurt far more than the whispers surrounding her. One guest quietly shook his head, clearly uncomfortable, but he lowered his eyes instead of speaking. Another woman reached for her champagne and forced a polite smile, pretending the humiliation unfolding only a few feet away belonged to someone else's world. Naomi understood that kind of silence. She had seen it before. People often believed kindness was valuable until kindness demanded courage. She folded the damp cloth, reached for a fresh one, and continued cleaning until the marble slowly regained its mirror-like shine. Then another voice interrupted the fragile calm. "You missed a spot," a man said with a careless grin, pointing toward a place where no stain remained. Several guests laughed, not because the remark was clever, but because laughter allowed them to belong to the louder side of the room. Naomi looked toward the empty space, realized exactly what he was doing, and quietly wiped the perfectly clean marble anyway. She refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her lose control. Deep inside, disappointment pressed heavier than anger. She wondered when dignity had become something that could be taken away simply because a uniform looked different from an evening gown. Above the ballroom, Adrian Castellano remained motionless behind the carved balcony railing. The warm chandelier light reached only part of his face, leaving the rest hidden in shadow. His calm brown eyes followed every exchange without distraction. He noticed who laughed first, who encouraged the cruelty, who remained silent, and who looked away in quiet shame. Years of leadership had taught him that character revealed itself most clearly when people believed no one important was watching. He had arrived only minutes earlier after concluding a private business meeting in another wing of the estate. Instead of announcing his presence, he had paused when he heard the first accusation below. Since then, he had watched the entire scene unfold without interruption. Not because he approved, but because truth often revealed itself completely only after people believed they would never face consequences. Naomi carefully stood with the folded cleaning cloth still in her hands. The floor looked flawless again, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom had grown noticeably colder. She offered a respectful apology for the inconvenience despite knowing she had caused none of it. Before she could return to her duties, one guest stepped directly into her path and smiled with quiet satisfaction, convinced the evening still belonged entirely to those with wealth, influence, and the loudest voices. High above them, Adrian finally released his hand from the polished stone railing and turned toward the grand staircase. Adrian Castellano descended the grand staircase without haste, each measured step echoing softly through the ballroom until even the string quartet seemed to fade into the background. His tailored black suit, open black shirt, and composed expression carried the quiet authority of a man who never needed to raise his voice to command attention. Conversations dissolved one by one as guests finally realized the owner of the estate had been present long enough to witness far more than they had expected. Naomi remained standing beside the polished service table with the folded cleaning cloth still resting in her hands. She lowered her eyes respectfully, believing the evening might become even more difficult now that the master of the house had arrived. She had no reason to expect kindness. Powerful people, she had learned, often protected their reputation before protecting the truth. Adrian stopped several feet away from the gathering without looking at Naomi first. Instead, his calm brown eyes slowly moved across the faces surrounding her. He recognized nearly every guest. Some were longtime business partners. Others represented influential families whose support had benefited countless ventures over the years. Yet tonight he was not measuring their wealth, their connections, or their reputation. He was measuring something far more valuable. Character. No one spoke. No one laughed anymore. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier quietly disappeared beneath the weight of his silent observation. Adrian finally looked down at the spotless marble floor where the last trace of spilled wine had already vanished. Then he raised his eyes toward Naomi. "Who spilled the wine?" he asked in an even voice. The question floated gently through the ballroom, but no one rushed to answer. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before speaking with complete honesty. She explained that the accident had happened during the crowded reception and that she had not seen exactly whose arm had struck the glass. She refused to accuse anyone, even now. Adrian listened without interruption. Her answer revealed exactly what he had expected. She protected the truth even when the truth offered her no immediate reward. One of the guests suddenly forced a light laugh, and stepped forward with an easy smile. "It was only a misunderstanding," he said. "The maid has already cleaned everything. There is really nothing worth discussing anymore." Several others nodded quickly, eager to move the evening forward before uncomfortable questions became dangerous conversations. Adrian remained completely still. His expression never changed. "A misunderstanding," he repeated quietly. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. "Interesting." He glanced once more toward the marble floor before shifting his attention back to the guest. If it was only a misunderstanding, why was someone ordered to kneel? No one answered. The silence became heavier than the chandeliers suspended overhead. A woman lowered her champagne glass. Another guest looked toward the nearest window instead of meeting Adrian's eyes. Mrs. Brooks, the estate manager, stood near the entrance with several household employees, all of them watching in complete silence. Naomi felt every heartbeat inside her chest, uncertain whether speaking again would make matters worse. Adrian noticed the uncertainty in her expression. "Miss Carter," he said with calm respect, "please remain exactly where you are." His choice of words surprised the room. He had addressed her by name instead of by her position. That small gesture carried more weight than anyone expected. For the first time that evening, several members of the staff lifted their heads. The guests began exchanging uncertain glances, sensing that the balance of power inside the ballroom had quietly shifted. Adrian folded his hands behind his back and slowly turned to face the circle of silent spectators, his composed gaze revealing that the real conversation had not yet begun. The man who had first demanded that Naomi kneel forced another confident smile, believing the uncomfortable silence would eventually pass if no one admitted what everyone had witnessed. He straightened the front of his expensive jacket and addressed Adrian with practiced ease, insisting that the entire evening had become far more serious than necessary. According to him, the maid had simply followed instructions to clean a spill before someone slipped on the polished marble floor. Several nearby guests nodded with visible relief, eager to accept the convenient explanation. Adrian listened without interrupting. His calm expression never shifted, and that quiet composure unsettled the room more than any angry reaction could have. He slowly turned toward Mrs. Brooks, the estate manager, and asked one simple question. "Is kneeling part of our employee standards?" Mrs. Brooks answered immediately. "No, sir. Every member of our staff is trained to clean spills safely and professionally. No employee is ever instructed to kneel because of a guest's demand." The answer settled over the ballroom like a heavy curtain. Adrian returned his attention to the guests. Then someone created a rule that does not exist. No one volunteered another explanation. Naomi remained exactly where she had been asked to stand, her hands folded neatly in front of her, uncertain why the owner of the estate continued protecting both the facts and her dignity with such careful precision. Adrian noticed her quiet patience before speaking again. "Miss Carter, did anyone from this household instruct you to kneel?" Naomi answered honestly, just as she had from the beginning. "No, sir." Adrian gave a single nod. "Thank you." Those two words carried unexpected warmth because they acknowledged her honesty instead of her position. Several members of the household staff exchanged brief glances, realizing they were watching something much larger than the resolution of a misunderstanding. They were watching the values of the estate being defined in front of every influential guest present. The man who had spoken so confidently earlier shifted his weight and attempted another explanation. He claimed everyone had only been joking and that no real harm had been intended. Adrian met his eyes without raising his voice. Humor ends when another person's dignity becomes the price of the laughter. The sentence lingered through the ballroom, leaving no space for another excuse. A woman who had remained silent throughout the evening quietly lowered her gaze, visibly uncomfortable with the role she had played by saying nothing. Another guest slowly placed his glass on the table, realizing that silence could also become a choice people remembered. Adrian took one measured step toward the center of the room. "This estate welcomes guests from every background," he said evenly. "The same respect extended to every guest will also be extended to every employee. That principle is not negotiable." No one challenged him. The musicians had stopped playing entirely, and even the staff standing near the entrance remained perfectly still. Naomi felt the weight pressing against her chest begin to lift, not because anyone had apologized yet, but because someone with unquestionable authority had finally named the truth for what it was. Adrian looked once more toward the guests gathered around him. "Before this evening continues," he said calmly, "there is one matter that will be addressed completely." The room fell into absolute silence as every eye turned toward him, waiting to discover what accountability would look like when it arrived without anger, without threats, and without a single unnecessary word. Adrian allowed the silence to remain untouched for several long seconds because experience had taught him that truth often became impossible to ignore once every excuse had disappeared. He slowly looked around the ballroom, meeting the eyes of every guest who had watched the humiliation without objecting. None of them could claim they had misunderstood what had happened. None of them could pretend they had not been present. Finally, Adrian spoke in the same calm voice that had carried through every boardroom and negotiation throughout his career. "Respect is the first condition for entering this home. Wealth has never been." The words settled over the gathering with quiet certainty. He turned toward the man who had first ordered Naomi to kneel. "You believed authority belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It does not. Authority belongs to the person willing to protect what is right, even when it is inconvenient." The guest attempted one final explanation, insisting that emotions had been exaggerated and that everyone should simply move on. Adrian listened without interruption before answering with complete composure. "Moving on without accountability only teaches people that the same choice may be repeated tomorrow." He then faced the estate manager. "Mrs. Brooks, please make a note that every invitation extended to the individuals directly responsible for this incident is withdrawn until further notice. Future events at this estate will welcome only those who understand that every member of this household deserves the same basic respect as every guest." No anger entered his voice. No dramatic gesture followed. Yet the decision landed with unmistakable weight. Several guests lowered their heads, realizing that influence could disappear far more quietly than it had been earned. Adrian then shifted his attention toward Naomi. She still stood with remarkable composure despite the difficult evening, holding herself with the same dignity she had shown from the very beginning. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for remaining professional when others failed to do the same." Naomi looked up in quiet surprise. She had expected the evening to end with instructions to return to work, not with public recognition. "You represented this estate with more grace than many people who arrived here believing they represented themselves with honor," Adrian continued. The members of the household staff exchanged proud smiles that they quickly tried to hide. For years they had worked behind the scenes, often unnoticed except when something went wrong. Tonight they watched one of their own receive the respect she had always deserved. Adrian invited Naomi to stand beside him rather than apart from everyone else. The simple gesture transformed the atmosphere inside the ballroom. She was no longer isolated at the edge of the gathering. She stood where every person could clearly see that her dignity had never depended upon another person's opinion. Adrian addressed the room one final time. "Every employee in this estate carries responsibility, professionalism, and trust. They are not decorations within someone else's evening. They are people. Anyone unable to recognize that will not be comfortable here." No one challenged him. Even those who privately disagreed understood that the conversation had ended. The musicians quietly resumed their performance, but the melody now felt different, softer, and more reflective. Naomi took a slow breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. The polished marble beneath her feet looked exactly as it had before the evening began, yet everything else inside the grand ballroom had changed. Without raising his voice even once, Adrian had replaced humiliation with dignity, and every person present understood they had witnessed a standard that would define the Castellano estate long after the lights faded and the guests returned home. The following morning, the Castellano estate awakened beneath soft autumn sunlight that streamed through towering windows, casting long reflections across the same marble floor where the previous evening had tested the character of everyone present. Nothing about the building itself had changed, yet every employee sensed that something important had shifted. Conversations among the staff carried a quiet confidence that had not existed before. Housekeepers greeted one another with brighter smiles. Servers prepared the dining room with renewed pride, and even the newest employees stood a little taller, knowing that the values spoken publicly the night before were more than elegant words. They had become the standard by which the estate would now be measured. Naomi arrived before sunrise as she always did, dressed neatly in her pressed uniform and ready for another day of work. She expected curious looks and whispered conversations, yet instead she received warm greetings from colleagues who had watched the events unfold. Mrs. Brooks welcomed her with genuine appreciation and thanked her for demonstrating extraordinary professionalism under difficult circumstances. Naomi answered with the same humility that had guided her from the beginning. She insisted that every member of the staff had worked just as hard and deserved the same respect. Her response quietly confirmed what Adrian had already recognized. Dignity had never changed who Naomi was. It had simply become visible for everyone else to see. Later that morning, Adrian invited every department manager and employee to gather inside the estate's grand library. Shelves filled with leather-bound books surrounded the room, while sunlight illuminated polished oak tables where generations of important decisions had been made. Adrian stood before the assembled staff with his usual calm expression. He did not mention individual guests or repeat the uncomfortable details from the previous evening. Instead, he spoke about principles. He explained that excellence could never exist without respect, and that every successful household, business, or family depended upon people trusting one another regardless of title or position. He announced a clear policy that every employee would be treated with courtesy and that concerns would always be heard fairly. The room remained completely silent, not because anyone feared speaking, but because every person understood they were witnessing the beginning of a healthier culture. Adrian then surprised everyone by turning toward Naomi. He thanked her once again for representing the estate with honesty, patience, and professionalism during a difficult situation. He explained that leadership was not measured only by authority. Sometimes leadership appeared through quiet integrity when no advantage could be gained. He invited Naomi to assist Mrs. Brooks with mentoring newly hired staff, believing her example would strengthen the entire household. Naomi accepted with sincere gratitude, humbled by the opportunity rather than seeking recognition. Around the room, several experienced employees smiled with approval, knowing the responsibility had been earned through character instead of favoritism. As the meeting concluded, sunlight continued pouring through the tall windows, filling the library with warmth that seemed to reflect the renewed spirit of the estate itself. The previous evening would always be remembered, not because someone had been humiliated, but because one person's unwavering dignity had inspired another person with the authority to transform that dignity into a lasting standard for everyone who would walk through those doors in the years ahead. Weeks passed, and the changes inside the Castellano estate became impossible to overlook. New employees who arrived expecting only demanding standards quickly discovered something far more meaningful. They found a workplace where respect was practiced as carefully as excellence. Naomi embraced her new responsibility with the same quiet humility that had always defined her character. Every morning, she welcomed new members of the household staff, patiently demonstrating not only how each task should be completed, but also why every detail mattered. She reminded them that serving with professionalism never required surrendering their self-respect. Her words carried unusual weight because everyone knew she had lived through a moment that could have broken her spirit, yet somehow it had revealed her greatest strength instead. One afternoon, a young housekeeper accidentally dropped an expensive porcelain serving dish while preparing for another formal gathering. The sharp sound echoed through the service corridor, and the frightened employee immediately apologized, convinced she had just lost the opportunity she had worked so hard to earn. Naomi walked over calmly, knelt beside the scattered pieces, and offered the young woman a reassuring smile. She quietly explained that accidents could be replaced, but honesty and responsibility were far more valuable. Together, they carefully collected every broken piece before informing Mrs. Brooks about what had happened. Instead of fear, the young employee experienced understanding. Instead of shame, she received guidance. Standing nearby, Adrian had witnessed the entire exchange while reviewing preparations for the evening event. He noticed that Naomi had repeated the same compassion she herself had wished someone would have shown only weeks earlier. Without realizing it, she had become the living example of the values he hoped would define the estate long into the future. Later that evening, another reception welcomed community leaders, business partners, and charitable organizations. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from the previous gathering. Guests greeted members of the staff by name. Several thanked servers personally after receiving refreshments. Conversations carried warmth instead of quiet superiority. One elderly guest even complimented the professionalism of the household employees, observing that genuine hospitality always began with mutual respect. Adrian listened without interruption, quietly pleased that the culture he envisioned was beginning to shape itself through everyday actions rather than formal speeches. During the reception, he approached Naomi near the entrance hall, where she was helping coordinate the service schedule. He thanked her privately for the positive influence she had brought to the estate. Naomi answered with her usual modesty, explaining that everyone deserved an opportunity to be treated fairly and that kindness often encouraged more kindness in return. Adrian nodded thoughtfully, recognizing once again that true leadership sometimes appeared in the calm consistency of ordinary actions instead of dramatic moments. Around them the evening unfolded with effortless grace. Employees moved confidently through the ballroom. Guests responded with courtesy, and the elegant surroundings seemed brighter because respect had become part of the atmosphere itself. Looking across the grand hall, Adrian realized that changing one difficult evening had quietly transformed countless ordinary days that followed, while Naomi continued serving not only with skill, but with a dignity that inspired everyone fortunate enough to work beside her. Several months later, the Castellano estate had become known for something far more valuable than its elegant architecture or distinguished guest list. Visitors often admired the flawless service, yet those who returned spoke about something less visible. They spoke about the atmosphere. Respect had quietly become part of the identity of the household. New employees adapted quickly because they learned from example rather than instruction alone. Naomi continued guiding every new member of the staff with patience, professionalism, and quiet confidence. She never mentioned the difficult evening that had changed so much. She believed the future deserved more attention than the past, and that belief shaped every conversation she had with those around her. One crisp autumn afternoon, the estate hosted a fundraising reception for local education and community programs. Representatives from charities, educators, business leaders, and longtime partners gathered beneath the familiar crystal chandeliers. The ballroom looked as magnificent as ever, but the feeling inside it had changed completely. Guests greeted employees warmly. Conversations flowed naturally, and appreciation replaced the distant formality that had once filled the room. While welcoming arrivals, Naomi noticed a distinguished older woman standing alone near the entrance, studying the activity with thoughtful eyes. The woman quietly asked whether Naomi enjoyed working at the estate. Naomi smiled sincerely before answering that every workplace had challenges, but genuine leadership could change the experience of everyone who served there. She spoke with gratitude rather than resentment, never realizing that Adrian had overheard the exchange while greeting several community organizers nearby. The older guest later approached Adrian and complimented him on the culture he had built. She explained that luxurious buildings always impressed people for a few moments, but the way employees carried themselves revealed the true character of those who led them. Adrian accepted the compliment with characteristic humility and replied that the strongest foundations were built by people who chose integrity every day, especially when no recognition was expected. Later in the evening, he invited the household staff to join the guests for a brief expression of appreciation before the event concluded. It was a tradition that had never existed before. Every employee received sincere applause for the countless unseen efforts that allowed each gathering to succeed. Naomi stood quietly among her colleagues, surprised once again that recognition could feel so meaningful when offered with complete sincerity. Around the ballroom, several guests approached members of the staff individually to thank them for their professionalism. The simple conversations carried more warmth than expensive decorations ever could. As the reception drew to a close, sunlight faded beyond the tall windows, and the chandeliers filled the hall with a gentle golden glow. Adrian looked across the room and realized that the greatest achievement of the estate was no longer measured by influential visitors or successful events. It was measured by the confidence visible in every employee who walked its halls without fear of losing their dignity. Naomi gathered the final service tray with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, yet now every step reflected not only personal strength, but also the lasting influence one act of fairness could have upon an entire community. The evening ended not with applause for power, but with quiet gratitude for the simple truth that respect, once defended, has the remarkable ability to transform every life it touches. 1 year passed, and the story that had quietly begun on a polished marble floor continued shaping lives in ways no one could have predicted. The Castellano estate remained a place of remarkable elegance, but visitors now remembered something far more enduring than crystal chandeliers or grand architecture. They remembered the unmistakable atmosphere of respect that greeted every person who crossed its doors. New employees quickly discovered that professionalism and kindness were treated with equal importance, while longtime staff carried themselves with a confidence that came from knowing their dignity would never be measured by someone else's wealth or status. Naomi Carter continued serving with the same humble spirit that had defined her from the beginning. Her responsibilities had grown, yet her character remained unchanged. She greeted every employee by name, encouraged those who doubted themselves, and quietly reminded each new member of the household that excellence always began with respect for oneself and for others. Many who worked beside her never learned the full story of the evening that had transformed the estate. They simply noticed that whenever someone faced uncertainty or disappointment, Naomi was always the first to offer calm guidance instead of judgment. Adrian Castellano observed these quiet moments more often than anyone realized. He understood that lasting leadership was not proven through dramatic decisions alone, but through the culture that continued long after those decisions were made. Walking through the halls one afternoon, he paused near the entrance where several new employees had gathered after completing their orientation. He listened as one young attendant thanked Naomi for making the first day feel welcoming rather than intimidating. Naomi smiled gently and replied that every person deserved the opportunity to begin with confidence because everyone carried a story that others could not see. Adrian heard those words without announcing his presence. They reminded him of the lesson that had changed not only one evening, but the future of the entire estate. Later that day, the household staff gathered for a small anniversary luncheon celebrating another successful year. There were no elaborate speeches and no grand ceremony. Instead, there were sincere conversations, shared laughter, and genuine appreciation among people who respected one another regardless of title or responsibility. Mrs. Brooks thanked every department for their dedication, while Adrian quietly expressed his gratitude for the integrity that had become the foundation of the estate. He spoke only briefly, explaining that buildings could be purchased, traditions could be created, and reputations could be earned, but trust had to be protected every single day. As everyone prepared to return to work, Adrian noticed Naomi helping a new employee straighten a uniform before welcoming arriving guests. It was a simple gesture that required no recognition, yet it reflected everything the estate had become. The marble floor where humiliation had once unfolded now welcomed every visitor with quiet dignity instead. The same chandeliers still filled the ballroom with warm golden light, but the people beneath them had changed. They understood that true strength never required another person to feel small. They understood that authority reached its highest purpose when it protected rather than diminished. And on that ordinary afternoon, with sunlight pouring through the tall windows and honest smiles shared throughout the hall, the Castellano estate stood as living proof that the greatest victories are often won without anger, without revenge, and without raising a single voice. The memory of one difficult evening had faded into history, but the lesson it created remained visible in every act of fairness, every respectful greeting, and every opportunity given with sincerity. And that day, everyone who walked through those doors remembered exactly what dignity looks like.